Thank you, Roger. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to present to you today. So I'm going to talk around some of the principles around CPD, the categories in which you can earn points on, the difference between contemporary and generic. And I've also on this slide detailed here a web link which is taken from the Institute website, which provides information around CPD, the operation, and how points are allocated. So basically, to clarify, to obtain your CPD certificate and your professional competence, a CPD member requires to achieve 100 CPD points per year. And that's split between 50 contemporary and 50 generic. And we're going to look at, as I said, examples and what is the difference between those two categories. But for every claim, and we'll talk about the process of making a CPD claim, evidence of activity ideally should be provided. So that could be attendance at a training course, a certificate from a professional qualification, for example. So it is good to evidence the claims of CPD you're making, but we're going to look very shortly at the types of CPD. Next slide, please. So if we start with generic, so I've talked about the need for 50 generic points, and generic is basically classified as activities necessary for the day job. So the Institute will pre-approve training course providers, and we'll look at an example shortly of the Export Control Joint Unit. And it is fair to say that for any training course or any one training course you go on, the maximum number of CPD points is 30. So if, for example, you're claiming points for a 3-day, a week-long training course, the maximum you can cover for any of that one activity is 30 CPD points. You can also claim for conferences and seminars. So that, for example, could be 10 CPD points per day for a conference or seminar, 5 CPD points for half a day, and then 2.5 CPD points for an evening event. So those are relevant conferences and seminars linked to the actual day job. And if you are providing presentations as part of your own organization for knowledge transfer, you can claim up to 10 CPD points per annum. But if we move on to the next slide, we'll look at some specific examples here. So this is an example from the Export Control Joint Unit, and there are four activities indicated here, from half day to full day at different levels. And you can see there's a difference there in terms of the number of CPD points. And basically the number claimed varies by the length of time the actual workshop course is taken over, and to some extent also slightly the level of complexity as well. So clearly for an advanced complex course, it's more complex and in theory difficult. So therefore there is a higher number of CPD points applicable here. So again, that's important to note the difference here in terms of complexity to some extent, but length of the day, full day, half day, evening event, for example. So that's to give you some ideas, and obviously there's details on the website as well as on these slides. If we move on to the next slide, please. So again, some I think the examples here. Sorry, could we move on to the next slide, please? So yeah, so we've talked about generic, so let's now move on to contemporary. So contemporary is effectively activities over and above the day job. So this is what you're doing outside your day job. So for example, here a qualification with the Institute of International Trade, Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK Customs Academy, you can earn up to 50 CPD points per module of learning. So if, for example, a qualification has 4 modules, if you complete one module, you can claim up to 50 CPD points, which in many respects is your CPD allocation for the year. But that recognizes the length of time that's needed to actually complete the module. It is possible again to claim CPD points for external qualifications. the institute will require to pre-approve the qualifications eligible. So if you have taken a qualification, it must be relevant to export controls, and there aren't really many or qualifications out there of that nature. But it has to have some relevance. It can't be an external qualification that's nothing to do with export controls, for example. If you do a dissertation work-based report, you can claim up to 10 CPD points per report, but that again is a maximum of 20 CPD points per annum. So again, if you're doing a project or work-based report, you can claim. If it's reading materials to support your job role, you can claim. So for example, a book, an article, and a magazine. And we'll look at examples shortly of how you would submit that information when you're making your CPD claim. The maximum there is 30 CPD points per annum. We would get slightly suspicious if effectively people were just claiming for reading magazines and articles, and we would look for a spread of CPD points there, because this is about continuing professional development. If you train a secondee at your work or a new employee, you can claim CPD points again, up to a maximum of 10. So that's just to give examples, which again are from the website link provided, into different ways of earning CPD points. If you feel there's any other areas of CPD and that you want to potentially claim for, please feel free to ask the question, and we can give some feedback hopefully during the webinar today. If we move on to the next slide, please. So we've looked at the types of points now. Let's look at how you actually use the system to claim the CPD points. So you would access the system effectively through your membership, through your username and password that's been allocated to you. As you can see from the screenshot, you would click on quick links. You would click on My CPD, and then you would get the screen in front of you and you would press add entry. So that is effectively the main areas that you would get in to access the system. If we move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of adding an entry itself, we'll just spend some time on this. This is where, if you like, you're submitting it. So under certification program, you have a drop-down box, which you effectively just key in export control CPD. You would then click in the credit type, which would be generic or contemporary, the entry date, which is the date of your submission, and then a description. So there are a number of examples of description. It could be details of an event you attended and the date of the event. It could be a book you've read. It could be an article you've read. It could be training provided for new member of staff. Now, you'll also see at the bottom here that you can provide attachments by way of evidence. And in some cases, if you're claiming a higher number of CPD points, it's good to provide that attachment. Otherwise, it's possible that your entry could be declined, or you would get an advice seeking further information from you to justify the higher level of CPD points. That's not to say if you didn't put in, say, 10 claims of 2.5 points for reading an article, that we would just approve it straight away, because if there's multiple claims for something, we may ask for evidence as well. The credits expiry date is the end of the CPD year. So whenever your CPD starts, there will be an end period during the actual year itself. And clearly the number of credits depends on how many credits you're claiming. So you then will click submit. And if we can move to the next slide, please. So after you press submit, you would effectively, you can then see your status. So what is your CPD status? So effectively, you can see on screen here, you can see examples obviously taken from different activities here, where you can see it's approved. In this case, the CPD has been approved by the assessor. If it wasn't approved, it would say pending. If it was declined, it would say declined. And you can see the number of credits, and you have the running total as well linked to your CPD. So effectively, what the approver is looking for is an acceptable level of points, in some cases evidence, that's required, and linked in with the details of a number of CPD points. So that's a quick overview of what the screen looks like. It is fairly, hopefully, intuitive and easy to operate. At this stage, I'll pass you back to Roger, but very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I hope you'll see that the system is relatively intuitive and relatively straightforward. Like all systems, it's a bit daunting the first time you see it, but once you've done it once or twice, it becomes pretty straightforward. I think the thing from my point of view is that it is it is a very good way of recording the activities that you're undertaking as part of your job and as part of your personal development, and it gives you a real opportunity to easily track what you're doing and look at what you've done in the past and see how you're tracking towards the totals that you need for both your generic and contemporary CPD points tally. What I'd like to do now is to say, well, what does that mean for an export control professional? This system that Kevin's described is used for all IOE members. And so I thought it'd be useful to look through the sorts of things that we as export control professionals do and see how they would fit into this scheme. This is also summarized in the center pages of the December issue of Export Control magazine. So if you've received that, then this material is in there, but equally the recording of this webinar will be available on the Export Control Profession website, and you can refer to it there as well. So lots of resources here. So what sort of generic export control issues? Now you'll remember that generic is to do with the things to do with the day job. So the first few are pretty clear, that anything to do with export control regimes and regulations, like the courses from the ECJU that Kevin was just talking about, fall well into that category. Any courses or activities relating to ratings and classifications, anything to do with licensing and applying for licenses. Just an example that occurs to me, you'll be hearing that SPIRE is going to be replaced by LIGHT during the course of the next year or so. Not quite sure of the timing of it. But what that means is that if you're spending any time on developing your own skills in LIGHT, transferring information from SPIRE into LIGHT or what have you, then it could well be that a couple of hours spent understanding LIGHT or even contributing to its development would be a good way of earning CPD points. And the same with compliance and record keeping requirements. Slightly beyond the export control areas, anything to do with sanctions and compliance. And if you're anything like me, when a question comes in on sanctions, then it does generally take quite a bit of understanding and research, and it might well be that in order to answer an internal question on sanctions, you have to go and do some reading and some research into the sanctions that you're not familiar with. It could be that you could claim 1 or 2 CPD points for that activity as well. Third-party and individual screening is another activity that we export control managers and professionals quite often get involved in. So if you're learning how to do that on a new system, for example, that could earn you CPD points. We talk a lot about internal compliance programs. If you're in the process of developing your own company's internal compliance program, then the processes of developing that may well be something that you could claim as a CPD points as well. If you're involved in audits, investigations, and voluntary disclosures, again, if you're learning how to undertake those, then worthwhile considering submitting those as well. Same with development of policies and procedures. And I've put down here other areas of relevant study, including technology, finance, marketing, logistics, staff development. If there is export control elements of those, or sanctions elements of any of those, then that would count as generic. So lots of issues to do with the generic side. Now, what's worth bearing in mind for people in our sort of profession is that we all come from different areas, we all come from different backgrounds, and in fact, some of us have got different job descriptions from others. So what might be generic for one person might be contemporary for another, and vice versa. A good example is on the next page. If you'd like to do the next page, please. This is entitled Contemporary Issues for Export Control Staff, and the top item here is customs, tariff and tax. But if you are actually an export control and customs person, then customs, tariffs and tax may well be generic for you, where it's contemporary for other people. So once again, you have to look at what's contemporary for you, what's generic for you. But if you're an export control professional that doesn't really get very much involved in customs, tariffs and tax, and yet you find that it would be useful to you or essential to you to have an understanding of that, and you go away and study it, then that would be a good opportunity to claim some CPD points on the contemporary side of things. Similarly, you might get involved in JVs, licensing, not export control licensing, but technology licensing and so on and so forth, overseas investment, inward investment, things that are outside the normal remit of an export control manager, but that might well be important to you in your job. Then learning how these work is a good opportunity. Bit broader, emerging markets, intercultural awareness and trading across cultures. Again, corruption and money laundering, if you find that you need to understand about those, social responsibility, the international political environment. I use this as an example, but when I was being an export control manager, the whole question of the JCPOA with Iran built up, and we all had to learn a lot about that in order to do our jobs properly. Risk management and so on and so forth. So things that are relevant to what you're doing, but not specifically to do with export control, can be classified as contemporary. Just a point on this that occurred to me. Some companies have training courses that they put everybody in the organization through, or selected members of the organization through. We did a big exercise a couple of years ago on anti-bribery and corruption. Now, if you're put through that sort of training course, which of course is very important, then that's another good opportunity for claiming CPD points on the contemporary side. So those are the sort of subject areas for generic and contemporary. If you'd like to move on to the next slide. What I wanted to talk about here is what I've described as activity types. So bearing in mind that what we're going to talk about on the next 3 slides could be generic or could be contemporary, but what sort of things are you talking about? Now, Kevin's already covered some of these, but I thought I'd expand on some of these areas just so that you can see the breadth of the opportunities in front of you. So in terms of short courses, including face-to-face courses, online courses, webinars, such as today's webinar, seminars, these could be provided by the ECP or the IOE, as Kevin has already described, or other suppliers such as ECJU and so on, commercially available courses as well. But this can also include your own organisation. So it could well be that if your organisation provides training, then you can claim that training as part of your CPD, and you will make the best judgment as to whether you would claim that as a generic or a contemporary training course. Some of us have the opportunity to go on conferences and seminars, meetings where technical subjects are discussed and developed. If you go on any of these courses, then it's on any of these conferences, then by all means think about how you would claim it and how many points you think you might claim. If the assessor that Kevin referred to earlier disagrees with your evaluation, they will certainly let you know. I would recommend that what you do is to use the guidance that Kevin has just made and make a sensible suggestion as to the number of points that you would earn from a particular activity, and then the assessors will modify that if they think it's necessary. Kevin's already alluded to reading technical magazines, books, and other ways of achieving private study. Anything that you do can count, but bear in mind that a CPD point is roughly equivalent to about an hour's worth of activity. So you've got to do a pretty intense hour to earn a CPD point. I'd like to move on to the next slide, please. Now, we've talked about receiving training, but imparting skills and knowledge is another way of self-development. And you might have seen that from what Kevin was saying, you get good points for imparting skills and knowledge, partly because of the research you have to do and the preparation you have to do in getting ready in preparation for presenting or teaching or training. So if you're giving courses, then that's a really good way of earning CPD points, internally or externally. Now, many of us attend meetings, and these are the sorts of meetings I'm thinking where a new part of your organization wants to talk about developing some new technology or some new markets, and they say, right, we want to know what the export control implications of what we're doing in this area are. That's a really good way of claiming CPD points, because you'll need to do some research in order to answer the questions they're asking. You have to bear in mind, of course, that what happens in your company, these sorts of questions may well be confidential. So you have to think very carefully about how you're going to make a submission for a CPD claim and work with the assessor in making sure they understand what you are doing and what the work that you had to do is, without giving away trade secrets that belong to your company. There's also any activities associated with the export control profession or the IOE and IT. And just as an example, one of our members has recently written a blog, and it's on the ECP website. If I was that person, I would think about the amount of time it took me to prepare that blog and maybe put in 1 or 2 CPD points claim for that time that's been put into providing that blog. So lots of different ways when you're involved in ECP or IOE activities that you can earn CPD points. Next slide, please. And Kevin also alluded to these sorts of activities: post-qualification studies, higher education in export control, or associated subjects, the sorts of things that would be developing your own professional career. And again, bearing in mind that these could be either generic, in which case they're related to export control and sanctions, or they could be contemporary. So if you were doing a master's degree in I don't know, mechanical engineering as alongside your export control job, or finance or something like that, that may well be a good way of claiming a large number of CPD points. And other recognized qualifications, again, could be contemporary, could be generic, and again, we'd be looking for a reasonable level of evidence, both of attendance and of achievement in those things. And equally, the caps that Kevin alluded to earlier, these would all need to be borne in mind when you're putting in claims for these sorts of CPD awards. So that's a bit of a canter through the sorts of things that you could be doing. Let's go on to the next slide, please, which is a summary. So hopefully you'll have heard already now that continuing professional development is a real opportunity for export control professionals to track their own career development, to drive their own career development, to look out for ways of getting their career, their professional development tracked through a system that's accredited. We've talked about the CPD process, how to secure and record CPD points. And again, I want to emphasize that once you've put in a submission, you get a really good and clear record of where you are on your CPD journey, and it's very easy to follow it. We've talked about generic export control issues, and we talked about contemporary issues for export control staff and what the difference between generic and contemporary is. And we've talked about qualifying activity types. We looked at 3 slides which showed the wide range of things that you can do that you can claim CPD points for.